All right. In the interest of time, I think we should get started. I'd like to welcome everybody here to this session, looking at job quality in the restaurant industry. We have three presentations that we'll jump right into. I'd like to first introduce Ouyang from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, who's going to be presenting on the effect of growth rates on investments in human resource management, evidence from franchise chains. Would you like to present your screen?
Okay, so I'll go first, right?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm late, folks. I had computer problems.
Yeah.
No problem. We're getting started right now with Ken's presentation.
Okay, so I'll start. So today I'm going to present this study that I and my advisor, Rosemary, Batt, are working on. So this paper examines the effect of franchise chains growth rates on the human resource management investments targeting their franchisees. So first of all, I would like to introduce to you a story of Kung Fu Tea, which is the largest franchise chain of bubble tea in the United States. So Kung Fu Tea was first founded in 2010, so it doesn't have a very long history. So my friend recommended this Kung Fu Tea to me at a very early time in about 2012. So at that time, there were only 3 or 4 stores around New York City. But then it expands so fast, and then a few years later, I found that Kung Fu Tea has expanded into Ithaca, New York. So Ithaca, as some of you might know, is a very, very small town. So I was pretty surprised. And then I go back to check the franchise disclosure documents since 2010. So I found that this brand has been expanding at a very fast speed. So in 2011, it had 3 stores, but only less than 10 years later, it has more than 150 stores in the United States. But the brand is growing at a very fast speed, but actually the service is actually kind of lag behind. Here are some of the comments that I collected from Google review targeting this Ithaca Kung Fu Tea. So most of the customers actually acknowledge that the product of this brand is actually good. The bubble tea is good. But many of them mentioned that the service is not very good. So some mentioned that the service is very slow, and other people mentioned that the staff are not very friendly. So it occurs to me that they're not doing very well in maintaining their service quality. So from the angle of a human resource scholar, so I would say that it could be the human resource management that has some problems. So from this case, we see that, so for franchise chains, they're actually facing a dilemma of growth. So that is a dilemma of quality and liability. So on the one hand, as franchise chains grow at a very fast speed, they want to ensure that their franchise chains have adequate HR practices that could help maintain the reputation and service quality of the brand. So, but on the other hand, franchise chains, they also want to avoid intervening too much into the human resource management of franchisees in order to avoid this joint employment status. So this is the dilemma that they're facing. So in order to resolve this dilemma, many franchise chains adopt a strategy to increase their investment over franchisees rather than individual employees. For example, franchise chains can increase training for franchisees. So they can use training to help transfer these management standards to franchisees and then from franchisees to individual employees. And they could also develop this HR technology. For example, they can use HRM softwares or online tools that help to automate some HR procedures such as hiring, staffing, and training. So these are the strategies that franchise chains can take during the growth process to help maintain their service quality. So the research question of this study is, how do franchise chains' growth rates influence its human resource investments targeting their franchisees? So there are actually two opposing arguments regarding this research question. That's the agency theory's argument and also Penrose's theory of growth argument. So first of all, I would like to introduce to you the agency argument. So according to agency theory, higher growth rates should lead to greater HR investment. So franchising actually creates this agency problem of free riding. For example, some franchisees, they may take advantage of the chain by underinvesting in human resource management and even violating some of the labor and employment laws. This free riding problem actually become more salient when franchise chains that are growing at a very fast speed. Because the cost of internal coordination is higher, the problem of information asymmetry is also more salient when the franchise chains are growing very, very fast. So faster growing franchise chains actually have more reason to develop and standardize their training and also to automate the HRM system using technology. So the agency theory would posit a positive relationship between growth rates and HR investment. But the other theory, that's Penrose's theory of growth, actually have a different point of view. So according to this theory, so growth is a resource consuming process. The speed at which the franchise chain can grow depends on how much resources and capabilities that they have. So when growing at a fast speed, franchise chains have to spread their financial, technological, and other resources to multiple growth-related activities. For example, helping their franchisees to open the units, to finding a right location, something like that. So the managerial attention would be highly constrained, and then human resource management at this time could be a lower priority. And also growth also is constrained by the existing managerial capabilities. So that is to say, the leaders of the franchise chains, they may not have enough knowledge about human resource management. They may not be able to develop appropriate HR practices that can transfer across their growing number of units. So from this theory, actually higher growth rates will lead to lower HR investment. So from here, we can see that the two opposing theories, they have different arguments regarding the relationship of growth rates and HRM investment targeting franchisees. So in our study, we try to reconcile these arguments. So we argue that Penrose's theory of growth actually serves as a boundary condition for agency theory. So that is to say, so agency theory, the argument of agency theory only works when we consider the key factors in Penrose's growth theory. That's the access to resources and managerial capabilities. So fast growing chains will mitigate the agency problems through investment in human resource management. But that depends on the level of resources and capabilities that they have. So specifically, we look at two variables. That's the size and age of the franchise chains. So we hypothesize that the growth rate has a positive relationship with HR investment only for large brands and older brands, because they have greater resources and capabilities to manage growth. So that's how we reconcile these two different arguments. So I'm going to briefly introduce the research method. So here are the databases that we draw on. So our primary database is a national franchisee level survey. So we have collected data from over 900 franchisees operating in about 150 franchise chains. So we collected this data by collaborating with Franchise Grade, which is a consulting firm for franchisors and franchisees. So that's our survey data. We collected our information about human resource management from the survey data. And then we matched this survey data to a manually coded database of brands. So this is a brand level data. So we collected the data from franchise disclosure documents. The work is done by Franchise Grade, the consulting firm. So the data about franchise growth was collected from this manually coded database. So we actually matched these two databases together. So due to the time limit, I'm going to skip all the data analysis. And then first of all, I would like to briefly introduce the distribution of size, age, and growth rates of our sample. So this is the 148 brands that we collected survey data from. You can see that we have brands in every bucket of this table. We actually oversample the large franchisees and smaller franchise brands, because as you might know, most of the brands are actually very large, and then most of the franchisees actually have a very small size. So we oversample large franchisees and smaller franchise brands in order to ensure enough variation in our sample. So I'm going to skip all the data analysis, and then I'm going to present you the findings. So overall, we find a positive relationship between growth rates and franchise chains investments in human resource management systems. But we find that this relationship is contingent on the size of the franchise chains, which means that high growth rates leads to greater HR investment only for large chains, but not smaller ones. So smaller chains do not have the capabilities to increase the HRM investment when they are growing at a very high speed because of their constraints in resources and managerial capabilities. We do not find significant moderating effect for age of the franchise chains. So one possible explanation is that the resources and capabilities that a chain has at a specific age, so when they grow at a very fast speed, they may not apply this existing knowledge to the growing number of new units. So there's no significant effect for age. So here are some implications of this study. So first of all, our findings show that a high speed of growth can actually threaten the work quality of employees. That is particularly salient for small size franchise chains. We also find that growth rates of franchise chains are actually highly related to HR decisions. So our findings actually support both the agency argument and the Penrose's theory of growth. So on the one hand, growth rates would strengthen the managers of franchise chains to invest in human resource management. But at the same time, high growth rates also create constraints on resources and capabilities. And lastly, so we find out these strategies that franchise chain can use to address their agency problems during the growth process. That is investing the resources in the human resource management of franchisees instead of directly intervening the HR management of individual employees. But the success of adopting this strategy depends on how much resources and capabilities that they have. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. And next, we'll continue with Towing the Line, Formal Requirements, Line Managers, and Organization Routines for Human Resources Practices in Fast Food Franchises. This is by Tashlin Lakhani from Nolan Hotel School and Rosemary Batt from ILR School, both at Cornell University. And Tash, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Can you see my screen okay? We're
Yes.
good? You can hear me? Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're so excited to present some really new research that we're doing that looks at the relationship between sort of building on what Can just presented, franchising, specifically franchise requirements, managers, and HR practices in fast food franchises. So before we get started, I thought it'd be important to sort of take a step back and talk about what franchising is and why it matters. So franchising has grown dramatically in recent years, especially in low-wage service jobs. Today, franchises employ roughly 6% of the US workforce, and most of these jobs are in restaurants and hotels. Franchises are creating jobs at a faster rate than other businesses in the US economy. And franchise chains today account for over 800,000 establishments in the US and over 868 billion in output. So what is the franchise business model and how does it work? So we can start with the brand, right? So you can think of McDonald's as the franchisor. They grant franchisees a license to use the brand, and then they set requirements for those operations to ensure uniformity so that they could essentially copy and paste those operations and then monitor them for compliance. In exchange for the right to use the brand name and the business system of, say, McDonald's or the brand that we're talking about, the franchisee pays the franchisor an initial fee and ongoing royalties, which are typically a percentage of gross sales. But after they pay these fees, they keep all the profits of the operation. So they are the residual claimants. And as I'll talk about on the next slide, this can create incentives to cut labor costs and quality. So how does franchising affect working conditions? Well, we know from existing research that pay and working conditions are lower in franchisee-owned operations compared to company-owned operations. So research in restaurants and hotels has shown that franchisee-owned operations have lower compensation, lower labor standards compliance, and make lower investments in HR practices that we typically refer to as high performance work practices and overall job quality than comparable company-owned operations operating under the same brand name. The question then becomes why? Why does franchising negatively affect working conditions? Well, there are two main theories that can help to explain this. The first is efficiency wage theory. And here the argument is more of a franchisor side argument. So here the argument is that because franchisors have to hire a salaried manager and employees to operate the business, and they can't be in every single unit, they have to pay higher efficiency wages and benefits and offer better working conditions to incentivize workers to put forth effort, to not shirk. The second theory is a little bit different in that it's not a franchisor side argument, but rather a franchisee side argument. So building on that franchise model I just showed you, here the argument is, hey, look, because franchisees are residual claimants, because they receive the profits of their operations, they have an incentive to cut labor costs and quality in order to maximize profits. And indeed, some recent research, including some research that I've done, provides some supporting evidence that, in fact, ownership incentives do appear to be driving some of the HR decisions in franchised operations. But franchisors, so the brand, also influences working conditions in franchises through guidance. So how do franchisors affect working conditions? Well, franchisors provide their affiliated units, both their company-owned units and their franchisee-owned units, with what we often refer to as superior organizational routines or rules or policies about how units should operate. And then they monitor and impose penalties for non-compliance or not complying with those routines. And indeed, franchisees, the reason why they even decide to operate a franchise in the first place is to gain access to those superior organizational routines and the best practices of the chain, and they pay a premium for that. And so the argument is that if franchisees are paying a premium to access these routines, they have an incentive to use them and will use them when they're offered by the chain. This includes HR practices that help franchisees transfer the business system and replicate operations. And in a recent study that we published in Organization Science, we show that franchisors assist franchisees with HR practices like recruitment and selection, and they train employees according to brand standards. There are also high levels of standardization and routinization in these operations that dictate how work is performed. So everything from the exact arm motion to use when you're salting a batch of fries to the precise way to assemble a hamburger so that the product is produced exactly the same way every single time. Even the now famous scripted line, do you want fries with that? And that can limit differentiation or variability in work design across franchisees and the amount of discretion that employees have over how they perform their jobs or even what they say to customers. What we do find is that franchisors are least likely to transfer practices that can confer legal liability, and Can referred to this earlier as joint employer status. And there are some HR practices that have a greater likelihood of leading to a joint employer claim, and that includes things like dictating how much you pay workers and benefits, so compensation practices or performance management practices. So in this study, what we set out to do is really understand at a deeper level how franchisors really influence working conditions. And we argue or hypothesize that this can happen in two main ways. The first is that franchisors can directly affect working conditions by setting those formal organizational routines or requirements for their franchised operations. And franchisors can also indirectly influence working conditions through managers. So what role do managers play? Well, research in human resource management has increasingly recognized the role of managers as intermediaries between organizational policies and operational practices, and more specifically, the implementation of HR practices. And here, researchers have found that managers play a significant role in enacting HR practices for frontline workers. And as you can see on the slide, the quote is, "Managers are willful and agentic actors whose knowledge, skills, and motivation affect how HR practices are implemented." We argue that manager knowledge, skills, and motivation to implement HR practices will be affected by their own HR practices, so the HR practices that they experience, and that franchisors influence the HR practices for managers in their franchised operations. And franchisors can do this in a couple of different ways. Franchisors can directly influence the HR practices of managers. So recent legal scholarship that did a contractual analysis of 44 different franchise disclosure documents and contracts found that franchisors directly set some of the standards and requirements for managers, things like job qualifications, training, scheduling practices, and selection. And so they can directly affect the HR practices and requirements for managers. But franchisees can also create HR policies for managers to facilitate compliance with the requirements and standards of the chain. Managers, in turn, will implement HR practices for frontline workers. And we argue that manager HR practices, specifically their training and their compensation, will provide them with the ability and incentives to implement and uphold prescribed HR practices from the chain. So just to give you a visual depiction of our model, you can see franchisor requirements having a direct effect on frontline worker HR practices. But as we hypothesize, those same franchisor requirements can also have an effect on franchisee manager HR practices, which in turn affect or influence frontline worker HR practices. And I won't spend a lot of time on the data and methods, but this uses the same survey that Can talked about. He talked about it in great detail. But this is a national survey of franchisees in the fast food industry. It was a stratified random sample of 1,008 franchisees operating under 159 brands in the top 75 metro areas. Our main independent variable is an overall franchisor brand requirement index that is composed of 3 different variables. The first is franchisor training, so the days of training that are provided to the franchisee each year. Franchisor HR evaluation, so performance evaluations based on labor productivity, staff performance, staff training, and labor costs, and then franchisor HR technology, so the extent to which the franchisor requires franchisees to use technology for payroll, recruitment and hiring, staff training, and time and attendance software. Our main dependent variables are the HR practices of managers and the HR practices of workers. So we look at 2 main HR practices of managers, training and pay and benefits. For workers, we look at 3 sets of HR practices. So selection and training, employee discretion, and pay and benefits. And then we control for a wide variety of franchisee characteristics, manager characteristics, restaurant and local market characteristics. So what do we find? Consistent with the study that we recently published, we do find that franchisor requirements have a direct significant effect on frontline worker HR practices. So we find that franchisor requirements have a positive effect on frontline worker selection practices and training. And consistent with the arguments regarding high levels of standardization and routinization, we also find that franchisor requirements, the more franchisor requirements there are, the less employees have discretion over how they perform their jobs or what they say to customers. And then also consistent with what we argued, we do find that franchisor requirements, because of those legal liability concerns, and the desire to stay away from joint employer status, don't have a direct effect on frontline worker pay and benefits. What we're adding here that's particularly new is our hypothesis about franchisor requirements and franchisee manager HR practices. And consistent with that argument, we do find that franchisor requirements have a significant positive effect on franchisee manager HR practices, specifically training, pay, and benefits. And perhaps most importantly, franchisee manager HR practices are associated with frontline worker HR practices. We find that franchisee manager HR practices are positively associated with selection and training, similar to the direct effect of franchisor requirements on worker HR. We also find that franchisee manager HR practices are negatively associated with employee discretion, again, similar to the direct effect of brand requirements on worker HR. And then interestingly, although we didn't find a direct effect of franchisor requirements on frontline worker HR practices on pay and benefits, we do find that manager HR practices are positively associated with frontline worker HR practices or pay and benefits. Okay, so what's the main takeaway? The main takeaway is that franchisor requirements influence the HR practices of managers, of workers and managers, who in turn manage workers in accordance with franchisor standards. So the main conclusion of this study is that franchisors influence the HR practices of franchisees, and they do this through their franchisor requirements. Requirements create standards for frontline worker selection, training, and work design or discretion, but those franchisor requirements also appear to influence HR practices for managers, who in turn enact HR practices in line with franchisor standards. So that includes higher investments in worker selection and training, and lower worker discretion to promote uniformity. Interestingly, we also find that positive association between manager HR and worker pay and benefits, which deserves further investigation. So in terms of our next steps, this study suggests a causal link between the relationship between the HR practices of managers and how they in turn manage employees, but we can't prove causation, so we need to investigate that causal link a little further. And part of that includes additional qualitative and quantitative analyses to really tease out the effects of franchisor requirements on both manager and worker HR. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tash. Thanks for that presentation. And now we'll proceed with Why managers matter, the impact of flexible work scheduling on quit rates and unit performance in the restaurant industry. This is by Hyesook Chung from Cornell University. Unfortunately, Hyesook isn't able to join us today, so Professor Batt will be presenting so thank you so much.
Thanks, Jiao. So I'm going to move through mine as quickly as possible so we have time for discussion. I just want to point out a couple of things. So the two papers are part of a larger multi-year study of franchising, and a couple of the basic insights and we still are in the process, is basically there's a lot more variation among franchise brands at the brand level and at the establishment level among franchisees than we normally think about. I mean, McDonald's is kind of the emblematic icon, which is a very control-oriented system. But we're finding that, in fact, there's a lot of variation in what franchise brands and franchisees do, and we're trying to sort that out. And we're also trying to sort out the extent to which control mechanisms from the franchisor down have a positive effect or a negative effect. So we know from the McDonald's case that there are a lot of negative effects, and we know that there's negative effects from standardization, routinization. But then the question is, under what conditions might we find some points of leverage in which the franchisor, for example, wants to do more training or ways that they kind of uplift the quality of the brand and in turn working conditions. So that's the logic of these projects as a whole. And now I'm going to show you what Hyesook has done. And I think I can share screen. And tell me if you can see this. Does everyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a very different project. It's an undertaking. This is Hyesook Chung's dissertation, completely different environment. This is a very interesting chain that decided to not franchise at all. They care about workers and quality, and they are trying to do the right thing. And so it's one large chain. And what we want to see is, again, this is leveraging variation at the manager level, at the unit level, where, as Ken and Toshper to some extent. And in this case, it's about flexible work scheduling. And as you know, flexible work scheduling has become very, very common in restaurants and service industries as managers try to, you cut labor costs and improve their ability to match supply and demand. So flexible scheduling, there are two types. The first is variation in work hours from week to week. So I might work 10 hours one week and 20 another. Then there's variation in schedules, i.e. I may work in the morning one time, in the evening another. And it's very hard to get accurate data on what these look like. And fortunately, Hyesook was able to get a download of a couple of years of data of the precise schedules of every single worker in this chain. And it was a massive effort. And together, so these lead to very high levels of unpredictability for workers. So what is flexible for managers becomes unpredictable for workers. And the setting, of course, is the restaurant industry, very hard hit by the pandemic. And so this study examines this conventional wisdom, which is that restaurants make more money when they use flexible or variable schedules because it lowers labor costs. And this fact should hold even more during the pandemic when restaurants faced greater uncertainty. So we were able to leverage the event of the pandemic to look pre and post pandemic to see what's going on. But there are two alternatives that exist. Managers' views, right, are that companies face unpredictable customer demands. So they have to essentially use flexible work schedules to reduce labor costs by matching supply to demand, and profits are higher when labor costs are lower. So they think this is a good thing and they have to do it because of these demand fluctuations. The alternative view is that flexible schedules from the worker's point of view create unpredictability, financial insecurity, health problems, inability to hold a second job, work-life conflicts. And there's quite a literature that has been developed, particularly in sociology, around the negative effects of unpredictability on workers. And so workers are more likely to quit, and our general research shows the higher quit rates lead to lower organizational performance. So we have a bunch of literature here that shows there's a negative effect on workers. We have no literature that asks whether this flexible scheduling that's supposed to be so great for managers actually improves performance. So that's what this paper tackles. The research hypothesis: the more managers use flexible schedules, the higher the employee quit rate and the lower the performance in their stores. These relationships, that is flexible scheduling to turnover to performance, are stronger during the pandemic. And so you have a simple, relationship where flexible schedules, the more you do this, the higher the turnover and the lower the performance, particularly the recovery in the COVID period. So here's the sample. It's a prominent quick service restaurant. I indicated there's no franchising, a couple of years of data. And this is 161,000 employees nested in 2,000 stores in 32 regions. Typical store size is 20, average age of workers is 27%, female 52. I'll just say it was an amazing, it's a very, very difficult quantitative methodological task to match all these employees' schedules that they got from the HR system to then unit level performance over time. And it's very complicated. I can't do this kind of quantitative work anymore, but my graduate students can. So the measures, her independent variables are fluctuation in work hours plus fluctuation in work times. Her dependent variable, the unit level turnover. So basically she aggregates the level of flexibility or unpredictability that the manager decides to do. And she matches that, aggregates it to the unit level, and then runs regressions to compare the impact on unit level turnover and unit level performance. And then there are all these controls. So the outcomes, as we predicted, the more managers use flexible work schedules, the more likely workers are to quit. The effects of these are stronger in the post-onset period of the pandemic. Now, let me just show you how you read this. I always have a trouble with this. Pre-onset, this is the relationship. This is turnover. This is variable work hours. So you see that this period prior to the pandemic, there was a relationship, a positive relationship between the variable work hours and turnover, but it gets much higher during the pandemic. In other words, workers had much more difficulty with unpredictability in the pandemic. They couldn't handle it and they just quit. Same with the variable work times. There's a modest increase here, but post-onset, you see a big increase. And so what Hyesook did then is bring together the measure of variable work hours and variable work times, which even is a larger level of unpredictability. And then we find that higher employee turnover is associated with lower performance recovery. Now, the way to read this complicated graph is that this is pre-onset, and you see that this is the relationship, the low variable work time. So this means that she cut the data in half, and those managers that make less use of flexible staffing, you see there's not much different pre-onset. Then this is the COVID period, and performance crashes. Okay, and then post-onset, you see that those managers that used less flexible scheduling did better, and those who used more flexible scheduling did worse. Now, you might see that this is kind of modest impact, but if you multiply modest impact over, thousands of stores and workers, the financial results are significant. So conclusions: contrary to conventional wisdom, this study shows flexible scheduling hinders performance recovery. Performance recovery is lower due to the high rate of employees quitting. And it shows that the same practice can also have different effects depending on the external conditions. So we didn't see as much of an effect pre-pandemic. We saw a lot more during the crisis. And I'll end there, and we can get on with some conversations. Okay.
Thank you, Rose. That was really great. So I was invited to chair the session. I'm going to offer a very brief comment and then open it up to questions. I'm Teófilo Reyes. I'm Chief Program Officer with Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. And so this session on job quality in the restaurant industry brings a lot of important information to light on many of the factors that directly impact this question, both in quick service and franchise operators. We saw that Ouyang focused on the tension between franchisors seeking to ensure brand reputation and quality of service while avoiding liability as a joint employer. Franchisors seek to resolve this tension by training on HR protocols and practices for workers and through the use of HR technologies to standardize practices. Ouyang asks, how do growth rates impact the development of standardized HR training and HR systems, and finds that faster growing, more aggressive brands invest more in these systems to exert greater control, but only among larger chains that have the resources and management to adopt this strategy. Lakhani further examined this tension between franchisors seeking to limit their employment liability and franchisee incentives to maximize profits by underinvesting in work quality. Franchisors seek to control franchisees through both indirect HR practices for managers and direct HR practices for franchise workers. Interestingly, this intervention has a strong impact on worker selection and training, but also a negative impact on worker discretion. And Chung focused on prominent quick service chain that examined the tension between flexible scheduling practices to lower labor costs on the one hand and schedule unpredictability, leading to greater turnover and lower performance on the other. Although employers adopt flexible scheduling to lower labor costs, Chung finds that the more unpredictable schedules, the greater the turnover, leading to greater disruptions and lower profits. These findings apply both prior to COVID and during COVID-19, but the effect is stronger during the pandemic period and is the cautionary tale for employers faced with crisis circumstances. All three of these presentations focus on job quality, but also on job quality beyond the question of wages. And I think by now we're all familiar with the concept of the Great Resignation, in particular in the context of the restaurant industry. Restaurant workers voting with their feet, refusing to return to the industry, even as most other industries have recovered or surpassed their pre-pandemic employment levels. Leisure and hospitality has yet to fully recover. I think mining and logging is the only other exception that also is not fully recovered. And the restaurant industry is still missing over 1 million workers at a time of record low unemployment. At ROC, we conducted a survey of 1,000 restaurant workers experienced during COVID in 2020 and found working conditions were very difficult, if not abysmal. Over 85% of workers noted they lost wages. 91% received no compensation for hazardous working conditions. 34% did not have PPE even 5 months into the pandemic, and 1 in 10 were forced to work with COVID-19 symptoms. We went back to them at the end of 2021, and 86% of these workers noted that they were working in understaffed restaurants, and 60% were actively looking for employment outside of the industry. Because of these market realities, we're finally seeing wages rising in the industry. But I think what we're finding out is that this is not enough. Workers want greater discretion, they want predictability, and they want greater respect. And I'm very interested in the market mechanisms that were described in these in some of these presentations. Like, how can we move a larger if these market mechanisms move, for example, larger, fast-growing franchisers to ensure greater job quality, can we also look at market conditions to create similar conditions for the smaller or older franchisers, or do we need to look at policy solutions? And similarly, what are the similar implications for what are the incentives that that exist to ensure job quality that leads to a growing industry with that as one of its main basis for growth, as opposed to the standard idea that you have to look at how you make schedules more inflexible. You have to look at how you lower wages, etc. So I'll end my comments there. Thank all the presenters for these great presentations, and open up the floor to questions from the audience. And I think people can either feel free to go off mute. If you want to put a question in the chat, I'm happy to read it as well.
Maybe I'll start first. I have a question for Tash. So I think your paper is very good. And then I totally agree with your major arguments that franchisors' requirement would influence manager and employee HR. So, but I have a question. So you have multiple requirements and you have multiple manager and employee practices. So how would one specific requirement influence the specific practice of manager and employee? For example, how would HR technology influence managers' pay level? So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And some of the analysis we did before we got to this point. So this is sort of giving you the broad picture, take a step back and look down, but we definitely looked at like individual requirements and how they affect both individual manager HR practices and individual worker HR practices. The story, of course, becomes a lot more messy and complex. And so in the larger paper, that will be something that will, disentangle. But for example, the question of how does like HR technology affect manager HR practices versus worker HR practices, and specifically what we find is that, interestingly, when we look at some of these requirements, they actually have a stronger effect on manager HR practices than they do on worker HR practices. So as an overall brand requirement index or a formal index, they have an effect. But when we break them down into the different requirements, the one that seemed to have the strongest effect on both workers and managers was technology. And this was a really interesting finding. The technology had a positive effect on manager HR practices, but a negative effect on worker HR practices. And the way that I think of this and explain this, it sort of makes sense when we think about it from the theoretical standpoint. If we're arguing that managers enact HR practices, the more technology they have, the more training they're going to need, the more compensation to incentivize them to use that technology and use it correctly. Whereas, for example, when, like we saw in the Domino's case, right? When we have franchisors imposing technology for frontline workers, like payroll or time and attendance or recruitment and selection type technology, this can have a downward pressure on the HR practices of workers, specifically things like discretion. It's going to limit the amount of discretion they have. It might even have a negative effect on their pay, like we saw in the case of Domino's. So I think it was interesting to find those opposite effects, and I think tells an interesting story about how requirements play out in practice. But you're right, we don't just need to look at the overall effect. I think it makes the most sense for a presentation like this, but in the larger study, we'll have to disentangle and look at how the individual requirements affect individual HR practices as well.
Hi, everyone. All right, thank you so much for these great discussions. I've been furiously typing notes throughout. I hope I've been capturing everything. I was actually quite interested in this discussion about technology and HR, and Tashlin, some of the points that you were just mentioning. And I was curious if you could maybe expand a little bit on what some of the most common technologies are that you see in, especially perhaps in some of the larger franchises that Ken, you were talking about. But what are some of those common technologies that you are noticing that are becoming increasingly popular? Are there new ones coming on board that you see, that kind of thing?
Yeah, maybe Ken, do you want to take this one since you talked a lot about technology as part of the quality control aspect?
Okay, so I think, yeah, technology is well adopted in many of the large franchise chains such as McDonald's and Domino's. For example, McDonald's have this what we call hiring to win system. So it helps each unit to identify the appropriate candidates. For example, candidates make the application on this system. For example, filling the demographic information and the other information. And then the system will help you to select the right candidate. And then they also have a set of these tools, what they call tools, like selection tools, selection tests. So these candidates can take this test. And then the system, the hiring to win system, will help you analyze the data and then help you to decide who to hire. So this is one example about how technology is used in human resource management. It's also applied in all other areas, such as another example is scheduling and staffing. So technology would help would help each unit to decide how many workers you should hire, and then how many shifts you should have, and how many employees you should include in every shift, depending on their past sales data. So it helps unit managers to make the decisions.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that, so there's all these HR technology systems that brands tend to promote so that they can standardize at the franchisee level. And we have from the field some examples of where we know that can have negative effects, like Ken was just saying. They also, a paper that Tosh and Ken did, showed, for example, that some HR practices, particularly training, can have a positive effect on managers and workers who kind of upgrade the skills of the workforce overall. And so I think that it's still murky how we try to understand and really even pull apart which pieces of the software systems are used in a very kind of a draconian way to, particularly the scheduling software, where you kind of match worker hours to customer demand, send workers home or call them in quickly. All of that stuff, it's pretty clear the negative effects. But some of the other stuff, it's not clear whether that just, the other thing is that the franchisees, we haven't talked much about them, but the people in the field say, franchisees are not very capable. We're talking about people that have one or two, or the vast majority have like maybe 5 at most. And so they're people who didn't invest in learning the business. They want a quick way into being an entrepreneur when they're not really one. They're not very capable. They want to make money. And so, who is the good guy and the bad guy in this situation, right? We have an image of McDonald's as the kind of bad guy, the big bad guy, imposing controls. But if you don't have kind of standardization of training, you have a mess. If you've got a lot of inexperienced managers at the unit level, right? So it's much more kind of a complicated variable landscape than I think we ever realized going into this project.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that the legal liability issues that we talked about, like the joint employer status, that complicates things even further, right? It places limits on what franchisors or chains can and cannot do, or will not do, I should say. I mean, they can do a lot of things, but what are they willing to do. And so the paper that we were talking about earlier that we just published sort of digged a little deeper into that, right? And thinking about like, okay, well, what would make them be more likely to be labeled as a joint employer? And so where are they more likely to take a hands-on approach versus saying, okay, you know what, even though this would benefit us, and we actually show in that paper a relationship between the exact practices they don't get involved in, so the compensation, the performance management, those are the ones that actually have the biggest effect on organizational outcomes like customer satisfaction and turnover. So they're actually the most important from an organizational standpoint in terms of creating that uniformity, but there is that tension between the legal liability that still makes them say, okay, I'm not going to get involved in this aspect of the operations, despite how important they may be. So there is that tension. And then there is the argument about, well, how much of this is the franchisee doing this because they just want to be the big bad franchisee who profit maximizes, and how much of this is a lack of knowledge? If I buy into the system because I don't know how to operate a restaurant, part of what I want from you is those organizational routines. I want you to tell me what to pay my workers. I want you to tell me how to treat my workers. This came up in interviews that I've done in the hotel industry, for example, and even some restaurants, where people would start asking me, because I was the HR scholar, like, what do I do with sexual harassment policies? Like, what do I do? How much, like, well, how do I pay my workers? And I was like, I don't think I can give you, like, I'm not going to tell you what to do here, but they didn't know because the franchisor wasn't giving them that information and they wanted it. And so they found other ways, of course, to do that, or to try to get that information and emulate like company owned operations, but that wasn't coming directly from the franchisor because of the legal liability concern. So it may not fully be a story of just profit maximizing. It may be profit maximizing in the absence of guidance. And that's sort of what we show in that paper. And we test using additional information on franchisor influence and multi-unit ownership, and show that in fact, when franchisees have access to the information, they do tend to use it more. So if franchisors provided it, they would use it, but there is that tension.
So I'm going to jump in. We're out of time, but I just want to give a shout out to Teófilo, who has been a long-term friend. He helped us with a survey we did of the restaurant industry in 2013. And he's been this amazing leader in the restaurant industry. He's now Chief Program Officer of the Restaurant Opportunities Center, Centers United, Rock United. And it's just an amazing thing. If you want anyone who really knows the restaurant industry, it's not any of the three of us, but it's Teófilo, who's been in the field. And I really thank you for, jumping in and looking at these papers and giving your perspective. It's really wonderful that you continue to, I know academics can get kind of out in the clouds and you bring us down to earth. So thank you for that.
No, much appreciated the presentations. Thank you. And I lean heavily on you. So it was my pleasure.
Yeah, this is exactly what Lyra is supposed to be. So thanks everyone. And thank you, Teo, and we'll see you.
All right, everyone have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.